Under every sin is a good and holy desire. That disappointment you feel or that anger you feel, even lust, we're trying to fulfill a real need in a wrong way.
Hello, and welcome to Working with me, Dan Doriani, hosting a podcast where we explore faith, work, culture, and the way believers can make a difference in their corner of the world. Hello, everyone. My guest today is Jonathan Pennington, a friend and articulate man, professor of New Testament interpretation at Southern Seminary in Louisville, which is possibly the biggest seminary in the world. If it's not the biggest, it's certainly very close to it. He's one of these folks that I admire because he doesn't just stay in academia. He speaks widely, he preaches, and he's also an associate pastor at Sojourn East Church in Louisville. He's an author of some very well-regarded books. I use one of them in one of my classes called How to Read the Gospels or Reading the Gospels Wisely. And then another companion book, to some degree, The Sermon on the Mount and Human Flourishing. I love the fact that you've written a book about preaching because I think it's good for exegetes. He's written a book called Small Preaching, very readable, easy to digest, about 25 big ideas about preaching. And finally, Jesus, the Great Philosopher, which is our topic today. Jonathan, good to have you here with us.
Always a delight to speak with you. Thank you.
Yeah. So this is a faith and work podcast. And as a consequence, I want to start up with a question about emotions and faith and work. We'll define them a little bit, talk about what the Bible says. But I'm guessing you would agree that the workplace can be highly emotional. You and I probably have both worked for people who are delightful and make us happy all the time. Mm-hmm. You know, if you interview people about their work and you say, do you like your job? They so often will say, I like my work because my boss. And if people don't like their work, they may say, I don't like my work because my boss. So emotions run high because of the atmosphere. We don't get to do what we want. We get frustrated. Tell us about emotions and work. How would you like people to apply your book on Jesus and emotions to the workplace?
Yeah, that's great. Well, of course, there's a lot to talk about in terms of what emotions are and things I think we'll get to as well. But you're right. You know, even as I think about my adult children and, you know, trying to guide them and shepherd them appropriately, you know, as they go into the workplace and things like that. You know, one of the things that does come up sooner or later is how do you handle this hard situation, this hard person or this hard situation at work? And as I've just thought about it and thought about their lives and my own life, the ability to wisely pay attention to and regulate your own emotions really, in some ways, would maybe be the number one factor about whether you're going to be successful in your job or not. Because sooner or later, there's going to be conflict, there's going to be disappointments, hopes, et cetera. And if we don't learn to pay attention to what's going on and learn to live with our emotions in appropriate ways, sooner or later, it's going to blow up. And work is certainly one of the places it's going to happen, you know, including church work.
Yeah, no doubt. So let's just dig into that a tiny bit. Why do we blow up sometimes at work? What is it about emotions? And by the way, when people get upset at work, and I've certainly done it, I think, why did I react the way I did? Or why did this other person in the room react the way they did? It's very tempting to say to people, I hate the saying, but people often say, hey, don't be so emotional. Mm-hmm. Well, that implies a view of emotions, that there's some irrational, out of control part of who we are.
Right.
That's not your view. What's an emotion, and why do people respond emotionally?
Well, I know we have a lot of shared views and shared influences, Robert Roberts and others on this. And, you know, for me, how this all came about was doing the work on Jesus, the Great Philosopher, and just starting to pay attention. Yeah, what are emotions exactly? And it turns out, as you all know, it was actually something, this isn't just a modern discussion. This is a very ancient discussion. And of course, modern psychology and neurology and other have their own opinions, but they all kind of are just, you know, some kind of warmed over microwave version of what the ancient philosophers kind of talked about. And my view would be more aligned, not identical, but more aligned with the Aristotelian view or the cognitive view. But most importantly, I think it's what the Bible teaches, that emotions are real. They're a really essential part of being human. I mean, they're not like something to get rid of. They're not something to look down upon. I mean, the Bible's full of emotions. And at the same time, we must learn to educate them. We must learn to disciple them or discipline them for our good and for the good of others. You know, so I think why people get upset. Well, you know, when you think of the creation and fall stories, you know, it's interesting that at the core of the problems that Adam and Eve first experience are two very negative emotions that I think continue to dog us and really mark us in our workplaces and everywhere. And those are fear and shame. And if you
Hmm.
look at the first two emotions that Adam and Eve experience after the fall, it's that. And if you start paying attention to our own lives, I think underneath everything we experience negatively is fear and or shame and or a kind of a cousin of those, which is grief. And if you're willing to, like at your workplace or wherever, say, just to pause, and it's hard to do in the moment, but to pause and say, what's going on here? And if you ask enough whys, like the seven whys, why do I think that, or why do I feel that? I think sooner or later, often on maybe the second or third, you'll get to fear or shame, because I think those drive so much of what we do.
Boy, I like that. First of all, you're right. The Bible talks about emotions so very much. I started looking up the number of times the main emotions were listed. I was in the thousands and I gave up. But
Mhm.
just between fear and love, which if love is not simply an emotion, it's a disposition to action, but it's also an emotion. But can I just disagree with you slightly already?
Yeah, sure.
And that is, or maybe we don't disagree. Let me just say that I don't think shame is always negative. There's appropriate shame. In fact,
Mm-hmm.
they have no shame is a line that appears a couple times in the Bible.
Fair.
So there's something wrong if we're not ashamed of some things.
Yeah.
But I think maybe you would like to comment, but the appropriate shame is when you've done something wrong and know it, and you
Mm-hmm.
ask the question why, and it's because I've sinned, and then you can handle it well. The problem
Mm-hmm.
is when you dwell in shame and just keeping shame upon yourself for something you did. It might even have been an accident. You backed into somebody's
Yeah.
mailbox, and you should not feel ashamed of that for the rest of the month. What's your view on that?
Sounds like a very personal reflection there. Like, did you back into
Well,
somebody's mailbox?
no, it's not me, but it's somebody I know very well. I'll leave it at that.
Someone who went up to the third heaven. Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. You're right. There is an appropriate kind of shame, and there's an appropriate kind of fear,
Yeah,
actually, too.
right.
Right. Not
Absolutely.
only fear of God, but fear of things. I recently preached a sermon on anxiety, which I've
Yes.
thought a lot about, and you probably have too. And I said the same thing there. There's actually an appropriate kind of anxiety, and that's not sinful or wrong.
Right.
Like I'm about to have my first grandchild, for example, and there's some normal kind of like
Yeah.
fear of what might happen.
Yeah. Right.
Sometimes things happen, and
Yeah.
I'll probably feel that for the next 25 or 30 years, with
Yeah.
my
Probably
grandchildren.
so. Yeah.
And so that's not wrong. Anxiety or fear or shame are invitations. In fact, one of my main kind of sayings, I do a lot of counseling and just pastoring people, and one of the sayings I like to use is that agitation is an invitation. So that whenever we pay attention, whenever we're aware of anger or shame or fear, or we're not even sure, that when we just feel that restlessness in our soul, an emotion, that's an invitation to pay attention. What is going on here? And it doesn't mean that what's going on in the emotional response is necessarily wrong or bad, but the key, I think, is to pay attention to them and ask the whys again. So what's going on underneath this, and why am I reacting to this? So yeah, I think you're right. I think there's an appropriate a shadow and a light side of every emotion, probably.
Well, I'll just comment on what I found as well under fear. The number of times when fear is good and bad are almost equal
Hmm.
and I stopped before I looked up every single reference, but it was
Hmm.
pretty close to 50-50. And then with regard to anxiety, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. You know Greek better than I do, but merimnao is often used for that. And
Hmm.
Paul uses that verb about his concern for all of his
Hmm.
churches. And he's not
Yeah.
confessing a sin. He's saying,
Right.
I've got a burden, and I'm going to admit it. Now, that burden could go in a destructive direction, right?
Hmm.
And he just filled with anxiety and paralyzed. But instead, he does things like write letters
Mm.
that have enlightened the church for millennia.
Like 2 Corinthians 1, I often think about that too, that he
Right,
describes
right.
that he's full of anxiety, even to the point of death.
Yeah.
And that's not, yeah, he's not confessing his sin. That's like,
No.
it's an evidence of love. I was just, with a dear family a young mother who just died this
Mhm.
week. And, there's just a lot of grief
And a lot of anxiety about the future. What are we
a
going to do
lot of
without
anxiety about
without
the
a mother
future.
or wife? Yeah.
Yeah. And
No.
those are not wrong emotions, I mean, and the grief is a sign of love.
Right.
The amount of grief I and they and so many others have experienced is directly correlative, or is the opposite side of how much love there was.
Mhm.
And that's okay.
I even think that fear can be a sign of respect for somebody. If you've ever been
Mm.
afraid of a meeting, and you're not a fearful kind of person, nor am I, but I think probably even non-fearful
Hmm.
people are afraid of some events.
Sure.
But we're going to meet maybe with a group of people that are going to ask you some hard questions, or maybe you're meeting with a very powerful person who's not the nicest personality in the world. You can be afraid of that meeting, and that
Hmm.
can spur you on to pray, to think carefully about how that meeting should go. You just do something with it. That's I
Hmm.
think one of your big points you're making now, and also in your book.
Yeah. I've been preaching for a long time. You've been preaching longer than I have. And I've noticed that even though I'm not aware of really getting nervous when I stand up in front of people, my body still is. Like I often have to use the restroom right before I preach or something. It dawned on me,
Yes.
oh, like I'm not consciously nervous, but that's a normal kind of game time ramp up, and
Yeah.
that's emotions. That's the gift of emotions that are appropriate to guide us and to help us and energize us and to again express love and to express care. Those are all the part of the function of human emotions that God has made.
Yeah. You don't want to start a sermon flat yourself. You want to be excited. And you don't want to start a basketball game flat either,
Yeah.
because the other team will rush right by you. I do think that that gives us a chance to talk about the theory of emotions, though,
Mm,
because some people define emotions as a physiological or physical phenomenon. They
mm,
say we're just labeling what we experience as a slightly elevated pulse and maybe a little bit of clamminess. And the
mhm,
researchers will put electrodes on a human body, and when somebody says they're feeling fearful or anxious or excited, they notice tiny increases in perspiration. So I'm going to call it reductionistic, but you comment as you will, that what we label as emotional states are simply terms we throw on physical states. What's wrong with that for you?
yeah. I mean, the word I was going to say as soon as you were describing it is reductionism, and that's the reductionism of all of modernism, and including the medical kind of world. You could even take it all the way to the level of like, mind brain. Like what's the difference? Yeah, can you find certain, fMRI can that reveal certain brain patterns when XYZ happens? Yeah, but that doesn't mean it's not also the reality of a soul and a mind. It's not just brain. And that, unfortunately, that's a lot of our modern Western kind of way of thinking is this reductionism. If there's a physical element, therefore that's all it is. But on the other hand, nobody really believes that.
Well, and there's also the question of what's driving what. I mean, if
Yeah,
is
exactly.
the brain or the skin driving what we say, or is what we say and
Hmm.
feel driving physiological responses? That is to say, we're getting ready for a presentation in front of a lot of
Hmm.
people, and so your mind tells your body, "Get ready, something important is going to happen." The causality is reversed, I think,
Hmm.
often.
Hmm.
Now, you also kind of like the Stoics in your book. If I can just talk about your book, and I do recommend
Hmm.
it. I'm going to mention the title again. It's called Jesus the Great Philosopher. Really enjoyed reading that book, and I recommend it to our readers. But you made an interesting comment there. You said, if I weren't a Christian, I'd be a Stoic, because Stoicism is the second best approach to emotions. Now, we do not expect you to renounce the faith and become a Stoic, to devote yourself to Cicero or anybody like that. But what did you mean by that?
Yeah, pray to receive Seneca into my heart.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Seneca, sure. That's what I
yeah,
meant to say. More than Cicero,
no,
Seneca,
no,
right?
Cicero's fine as well, or Marcus Aurelius, anybody.
Yeah, Marcus
Um,
Aurelius, certainly.
yeah, it's that's funny. I'm glad you picked up on that. When I started to think about not just emotions, but was started to think about Christianity in its own ancient context, for the Sermon on the Mount work I did a long time ago, that's when I began to sort of take a deep dive into philosophy. And I really, I find a lot of good in Stoicism. And of course, as you know, there's not only the ancient Stoicism, there's this very widespread modern Stoicism, Ryan Holiday and others, which isn't probably exactly ancient Stoicism as much as they present it that it is, but it's similar. And I just found it really interesting, and why I like Stoicism, even though, well, here's what I always say. If you read Marcus
I mean, it's
Aurelius, or
atheistic. We can just say
yeah,
it.
there's
It's
that. But
atheistic.
there are
Yeah,
actually a
but
lot of, I mean, the weird thing about Stoicism, every time I read Seneca or Marcus Aurelius or anybody, I always think this is so good
yeah,
and so not right.
not
In
quite
the
right.
sense that, yeah,
Yeah.
and the reason that I think it's good is because Stoicism puts a lot of emphasis on personal responsibility. It puts a lot of emphasis on the fact that, a lot of times we are just reactive and we need to pay attention. Seneca would say something like, you are as injured, emotionally or whatever, as you imagine yourself to be. And if you think about it, there's probably a lot of truth to that. Like a lot of
Oh my
times,
goodness, yes.
Yeah,
you know?
that we're upset because we're assuming things that we're probably not even conscious of. So the good of Stoicism that it does force you to kind of pay attention, take responsibility for your own emotions, take responsibility for your reactions. But at the same time, it ends up being such a, not it's a thin or philosophy of life, which is what it is, that cannot account for the complexity of our lives and the fact that there actually are things to be quote unquote emotional about. As we kind of said, there are real fears and there is real injustice. So if someone, harms your child, or if there's some kind of sexual violation or something, you can't just say, well, you're just upset about that as you imagine yourself to be. No, there's real injustice in the world, and God is going to set things to right. And the Stoics aren't as non-emotional as they're often depicted. It's just that they really emphasize that you need to control your emotions. And that, I'm like, that's awesome. But the way it ends up working out in Stoicism, it ends up being this disconnection from people. Right. And since writing that book and reading, and I still love reading the Stoics, since writing this book, I've had the opportunity to give lectures on it all over the place. And one of the times I was giving it at a university campus, somebody talked to me afterwards and pointed out that there's actually a philosophy that now what I say is Stoicism is my third favorite philosophy.
Oh, okay.
There's
All
one in between, and it's from the old Nickelodeon
right.
anime
Nicola.
kind of thing called The Last Airbender, not the
Oh, yeah,
movies, but
yeah,
there
right.
was like this
Mhm.
old, and I know that
Mhm.
sounds really funny, but stick with me because what happens in The Last Airbender, which is actually a very deep show, and and a lot of younger than us generation will have grown up on it, and it's a really good show. And what happens in it, the main character is kind of advancing through this kind of semi near ancient Eastern kind of Buddhist kind of philosophy, like there's levels of it. And when he gets to the opportunity to kind of attain the highest level of self-realization and fulfillment by which he can save the world, etc., he chooses not to because that highest level would require him to disconnect from all of his emotions. And so he chooses that his friendships and his love for his friends are more important than that ultimate kind of state of non-emotional philosophy. And it's like, wow, that is like, I don't even know if they knew what they were doing, but that is like an absolutely brilliant insight that is the same critique I would make of Stoicism, as good as it is. It really is. At the end of the day, it can't account for the central role that real positive and negative emotions play in all of our relationships. The solution to being a flourishing human is not to disconnect from things that cause us harm emotionally, but actually to lean into them in the presence and power of God.
Yeah. So first of all, Last Airbender's been on my playlist for years, and now maybe you're going to
Awesome.
push me over the edge.
You should
But
do it. You
I
should do
think
it.
most of the really great shows on television or movies, whatever, have a deep philosophical. I mean, there's somebody very very intelligent behind them. It's just why they're so
Mhm.
popular. So two things on detachment. First of all, I remember, since of course Sermon on the Mount is something we both study. Blessed are those who mourn
Mhm.
means it is more blessed to weep than it is to be indifferent. So if you see evil being done, which is better, to weep over it or to say, "Oh, that doesn't really bother me"? The Bible's answer, not only in that short statement of Jesus, but 60 Psalms of lament, is that it is better to lament, and the Bible is going to teach us how to lament. And almost every lament, as you know well, ends with hope in God and so forth. But I'll agree with you that a level of detachment is really helpful. And one of my principles I share with my students is, when in doubt, take it as a compliment. Meaning, if somebody says something that can be taken either as an insult or a compliment or neutral, just take it as a compliment and be done with it. And don't fret over what did you mean by that, which, by the way, is not only a professional point, but in marriages, why did you say that? Is the kind of thing, that sort of suspicion that you're wounding me, that is very damaging to marriages.
Mhm. Yeah.
So a
Yeah.
little bit of detachment and a little bit of attachment. The Bible's teaching both, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Let's talk about Robert Roberts for a minute, since we
Mhm.
both read him and like him a lot. And his definition of an emotion is a concern-based construal.
Mhm.
That's spelled, in case you have a hard time saying that or hearing that, construing things a certain way. So if someone's rushing at you with a sword. The question is, how do you construe that? If you're in the third row of the play, this audience, then it's exciting. You're in the front row for the battle scene. And if it's somebody in an alien city rushing at you with a sword, then it's terrifying, especially if they're large and it looks like it's gleaming metal. And if it's your nephew who's 4 years old and you're having a picnic, then it's, endlessly amusing. So how do you construe the person running at you with the sword is the great question. Kevin Van Hooser, one of our great theologians today, essentially accepts that. You and I both live in the South, at least at the moment. And I think there are certain statements people make in the South, like one of them is bless your heart.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, depending on how that's construed, it can be you poor slob idiot moron. May God bless you because nobody else will. Or it can mean, wow, I empathize with you so much in the sorrow that you just shared with me. So I like that definition. I don't think it's necessarily the perfect definition, but it's my favorite. What do you think? How do you like Robert Roberts?
I love it. Yeah, I think that really accords with, according to my analysis of the ancient discussion, that would accord with the Aristotelian or cognitive branch, which would emphasize that what our emotions are a response to a perception of some situation. And again, that's where Stoicism can be helpful to say, hey, your emotions are based on some belief you have, it's a construal of what you're experiencing. And as we said, I think at the end of the day, that can't account enough for the good role that emotions play in our lives. But I really like that. I think it's very helpful to think of it that way. And I love that analogy of someone coming at you with a sword in a different situation. As I remember in the book, I came up with one that maybe probably isn't as good as that, but like if someone, shows up and drops off a pile of bricks when you're expecting a steak dinner, then that's not going to be very exciting. But if somebody shows up with a pile of bricks when your house is the river's rising, it's about to flood your house, well, then, that same arrival, that thing that's given to you feels very, very different, depending on what the need is and what the perception of its value is. So yeah, it's good.
So he also says something I found immensely helpful when of course, you and I both are seminary profs to a large degree, and we have men who care too much about their athletic team. And they'll come to class on Monday morning and they'll be devastated because a total stranger did not hold on to a ball, whatever the ball. It might be a baseball, it might be a football, it might be a basketball. The ball somehow fell off their fingertips. And my beloved team lost by 1 point, and woe is me. And I'll say when I was young, I had the same problem of caring way too much about the exploits or lack thereof of total strangers who are not my friends and never will be. So why do I care so much? But he makes this marvelous statement about excessive emotions, and I'm just going to read it and invite you to comment on it. He says in one place in his book, the emotional person is weak not because he has emotions, but because he has such poor ones or such a limited repertoire. The concerns his emotions go back to are momentary, primitive, immature, badly ordered. He lacks personal integration and depth, not because he feels strongly, but because he feels strongly about the wrong things. So his feelings are erratic and chaotic. That sounds like something close to what you would say, except it's a little more poetic. I mean, it's just, it's like the sentence of the book, in my opinion.
It's really good.
But
of course, it reminds me of Augustine. I mean, the whole idea of that we are lovers and that what happens is that our loves get disordered. That language sounds a lot like that too.
Yeah. So if somebody walked up to you and said, I'm so emotional. I need to control. I need to just stop being so emotional. And my children, oh my goodness, my children are so emotional. Don't be so emotional, is what I find myself yelling at my kids. I'm yelling at my kids saying, don't be emotional. All right. I just came to you with that scenario. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, depending on how much time I had, if this is a hallway conversation versus a sit down,
Yeah, we'll make it 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Super hallway.
Okay,
super 3 minutes.
Okay, 3 minutes. Yeah. Well, that's going to be difficult then. But I think in some sense, I would try to actually ask the whys again, because I don't think that emotions are a response, as we were just saying, to something. So I think the way forward in learning to not be controlled by them, whether it's anger or whatever it is to ask what's underneath it and to start addressing what is the construal that is leading to this. And it doesn't take very long. I mean, for all of us, we all learned a way of inhabiting the world from a very young age that becomes our personality. I think our personalities and our habits are always a function of genetics and, nature and nurture genetics and
Right.
and kind of ways we learn to handle the world. And I think especially ways we learn to handle fear and shame and grief. And so what I do with people regularly out of love and care is that I often just kind of go backwards and start asking them, hey, yeah, well, just what's coming up for you? Like, what do you when you feel really emotional about whatever it is, a workplace conflict or something, what's coming up for you? What's underneath that? And just in a safe, loving way to start helping people learn to ask why, especially anger. Anger is not a primary emotion. Anger is always, I think, a response to fear and or shame. And so I often just will just create a safe space where I can just say, hey, what's going on? And it doesn't take very long that almost certainly it's going to come back to their childhood. And, the question I ask every single person that I sit with regularly is, what was the message you received from your childhood about how to find the good life and who you are as a person? And if you start unpacking that, we all got messages. We all got messages about how to live and what to do. And if you just kind of pay attention to that and care, you will pretty soon find what the emotional habits and the emotional registry is that's causing all these very emotional things. And I think that the way forward is to help people begin to pay attention to what the construal is in love and help them just take that before God and find healing. But so it's not a 3-minute fix, but
No, it's
that's
not.
the
But
way
it's
I
a
would.
3-minute answer. Let me poke you just a tiny bit. Maybe we're defining terms a little bit. So I'm not disagreeing that fear and shame are very powerful, but I would say my experience counseling with other people and thinking about my own life when negative emotions occur, I would put disappointed or dashed expectations very high in the list. So, for example, a mother or father whose child is misbehaving terribly, they didn't expect parenting to be this hard. They thought there'd be more cuddling and more joy. Or the person at work who signed up for a certain track at work, and he or she is convinced that he or she is working every bit as hard, every bit as talented, maybe even more talented and harder working than the other person who came in at the same time they did. And they can't imagine why that person is advancing beyond them. And they can be very, very upset, not because they're afraid of anything, but because they think some either injustice has been done, which is a kind of disappointment, right? Maybe that's my construal. That there's an injustice or maybe an implicit promise if you work hard and do your best and you're able, you have basic abilities and training, then all should be well.
Yeah, that I agree. That's a good point. In fact, for some time, I've been thinking a lot about fear and shame as driving, but I have more recently been adding in a third one, which is grief, which I would
Okay.
put
Yeah.
all of what you said truly under, we don't have to put it under that category, but I think that's what I mean by grief, which is the sense of loss. And I think injustice would be in that category. I think disappointment would be in that category. So the sense that we have that things are not right and that maybe even I personally have not been done right by, and the loss of that, whether it's like the death of my father when I was quite young, that's a grief that has stayed with me. I didn't realize that until in the last 10 or 15 years, or any small disappointment as well. I do think I would kind of maybe put that under the big category of grief as kind of that third aspect of negative emotions that drive so much of what we feel.
And just to tie it into work, we'll do rapid fire questions in just a minute here, but just to apply it to work one more time. So if I understand you correctly, if someone is finding themselves getting upset, distressed, angry, devastated, your basic counsel would be, what happened? Why are you taking it the way you are? What are your expectations? What were you taught as a child about the good life,
Mm-hmm.
about how to manage things, and
And what do you
where
need?
what do
That's
you
a question
need?
I ask people. What do you
Yeah,
need?
right, right. Okay, so you would say to people then, ask yourself a series of questions that
Mm-hmm.
probe the whys, the
Yeah.
motives, the grounds, and that'll help you calm down at work.
Mm-hmm. I
Yeah.
think so. And I like anything, any habit, it's developed both off and on the field, and so
Mhm.
it's not just in that specific situation,
Right.
but it's learning over time to inhabit the world in relationship to our own emotions by learning imperfectly to slow down and ask, hey, what's coming up for me and why is this here? And especially, in an environment that isn't full of piling on more shame. I
Right.
think in the sense of like, you just need to stop doing that. Maybe that's the voice we have in our heads, or maybe, somebody says that explicitly. I think you need the space it's okay to pay attention to what's going on. And one of the other main principles that I kind of operate by is that under every sin, which would include, the really negative manifestations of
Mhm.
emotions and actions that come from it, under every sin is a good and holy desire.
Oh, yes, I agree with that.
And what I mean by that is, yeah, it sounds like you've thought about that too. But I find it really helpful for me and for others to say, even that disappointment you feel or that anger you feel, that even lust or whatever it is that somebody's
Mhm.
struggling with, the idea is to say, hey, not just kind of, hey, just stop doing that or something,
Right.
but to actually say, what is it that I need that's underneath that, that's given as I'm created by God and designed by God? I need something. And probably what's happening in most of our sinning is that we're trying to fulfill a real need in a wrong way.
Right.
And I think that is very freeing to start just kind of looking at our things and not just saying, don't do that or stop feeling that way, but actually say, I need something here. And then to take that in the presence of God and say, I don't want to, whatever I'm trying to get out of lust or out of anger is actually maybe I want to feel loved and maybe I want to
Mhm.
feel secure
Or
and to take
respected.
I
Right.
respect it and take those good things before the Lord and
Mhm.
say, hey, I need this from you,
Mhm.
God. And I want to be free from not just kind of reacting and doing these things because I find my life in
Mhm.
you.
Let me summarize some things you said. And maybe we haven't used these words, but we've agreed that a statement like "don't be so emotional" is really not helpful.
Not at all.
It implies a negative view of emotions as if they're some aberrant feature of humanity. But you and I would agree that God created us with a mind, God created us with a body, and God created us with emotions. And
Hmm.
emotions are neither more nor less fallen than our mind. I mean, it's funny, nobody ever says, don't be so rational. But I mean, the
Hmm.
rational mind can reason its way to all kinds of perverse and terrible things
Yep.
and make a case for things that are dangerously, desperately false, as we know. So we pay attention to our emotions. When they go awry, we ask, what's good in this? I so radically agree with you. I could jump up and down. You can't be tempted by something that doesn't have any good in it. I mean, if
Hmm.
if if you're upset that you're being treated poorly, you're looking for justice.
Hmm.
If you're upset that the credit for your work was stolen by somebody else, you're looking for recognition of work
Hmm.
well done. So there's nothing wrong with emotions. Intrinsically, they're fallen like every other aspect of human life is, and they're
Hmm.
redeemable. And if we're redeemed, they're as redeemed as anything else. I think we agree on that. Let me go to rapid fire questions. Question number one: what is the best recent book you read on emotions other than your own? It doesn't have to be recent. Book you recently read. Yeah.
Best recent book on emotions. Ooh,
It doesn't have to
that's
be a recent book published, a
oh
recent
yeah,
book
yeah,
in
yeah.
your reading experience.
My, yeah. This is not going to be a perfect answer, but I have a group of guys I mentor at our church, and this past summer we read together a book by James Bryan Smith called True and what's it called? Good, True and Beautiful Life. That's not quite right. Dang it. I'm so bad at recommending books. It's actually on the Sermon on the Mount, but it,
Okay.
it really gave us a great opportunity to think a lot about the emotions because they do come up a lot in Sermon on the Mount.
They sure do.
Anxiety, lust, anger, they're all there. And so that was whatever the James Bryan Smith book is. I'm sorry, James Bryan Smith. I can't remember the title, but it's really
Hey,
good. It's
James
it's in
Ryan
the
Smith on the Sermon on the Mount. That's your
yeah,
recommendation.
he was a disciple by Dallas Willard, which I really like. So
Yes,
he's
yes,
in
yes.
that kind of Willard
Yeah.
category. So that was a really good book to kind of face a lot of things in our lives in a really thoughtful way.
All right. 30 seconds or less if you can. I know
Sorry
you're an
about
academic.
that.
30 seconds or less if
That was not a
possible.
quick answer. Sorry.
Well, no, I know. I'll give you maybe 60. What emotional experience would you like to have in the next
Uh,
5 years? What positive emotional experience would you
yeah,
like to have?
yeah. About to have my first grandchild, Lord willing,
Okay.
and that is already exciting. So looking forward
Mm.
to more of that.
There,
So
there are very few things more satisfying than being a grandfather. Okay, if there was one piece of advice for people struggling with their emotional life, you would say, ask yourself good questions.
yeah.
Is there anything else you want to say that you haven't said about
Hmm.
helping someone get a better grip, well, not better grip, but have a more emotionally healthy life? Is there
Hmm.
anything you want to say you haven't said yet?
I just would say that it's good for us to do it for ourselves, but also to create a safe environment where people can be honest without being judged or given advice. And I think that's a really crucial thing, to feel that you can really express what's going on. And I think that's
You have a
necessary.
safe conversation with somebody and they're not going to get upset that people
Or just advise you, oh, well, you need to do this, or something.
Right. Just receive it. Boy, what you've gone through is so difficult. Kind of conversation, and I empathize with you. Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, hey, Jonathan, so nice to be with you. We have spent the last while with Jonathan Pennington, who is a New Testament scholar of note. He also preaches. He also counsels. He's a man of parts, as they used to say, many capacities. It's been great to have you for this period of time. One more time, he's written a number of books, but the one we're talking about today is Jesus, the Great Philosopher. Thanks for writing and for giving us your time.
Thank you so much. Good to be with you.
Working with Dan Doriani is a production of the Center for Faith and Work St. Louis. We seek to promote faithfulness in the workplace, in education, in discipleship, and in the stories of believers who've applied their faith at work. If you want to put your faith to work and change your corner of the world, visit our website, the Center for Faith and Work St. Louis. Look for faithandworkstl.org. That's one word. We'll help you start a cohort with like-minded believers who also want to practice their faith at work. This podcast is donor-supported. To keep us going, please donate on our website. Maybe more importantly, you can support us by listening, by subscribing, by sharing, by liking us, by posting us on your favorite platform, or go old school and tell a friend.